So with the second half of reruns coming up in the 4.4 update, today I'm here with the should you or should you not summon for the reruns being Cerydra, Anaxa, and Aventurine. We're going to be going over their spot in the meta and how it's kind of changed since their release. Briefly touch upon their vertical investment as well for anyone that might be interested, and then reasons why you should or should not summon for them. Stuck grinding in Honkai Starro? Need Stellar Jades fast? We've got you covered. Head over to U7 Buy, your ultimate gaming hub for save, fast, and cheap in-game top-ups. Whether it's Starro or your other favorite games, U7 delivers instantly and players love it. Check out their Trustpilot reviews, they're actually top ranked. On the Honkai Starro top-up page, you can recharge your account in seconds. When you head over to the page, all you need to do is pick the pack you do want, enter your UID and server, and buy now. If you want codes and coupons to apply, be sure to create an account for proper savings. USD is a recommended usage currency for best saving. Once everything is set, you can see the savings you're about to get. Want even extra savings? Be sure to use code PRESR at checkout for 5% off. Perfect for last minute pulls or surprising a friend. Click on the link in the description, recharge fast, save more, and keep blazing those trails. So starting it off with Cerydra, Cerydra's role has practically remained the same and would of course depend on how much you would need her as the specialist for skill DPS as she is. Since she did release, she was best in slot for both Phynon and Anaxa, as they practically had the identical teams that you wanted to run, and that also itself has not changed. You do want to run them with both, and there has been one more addition of a character, well now two, where she's also best in slot 4 right now, that being the newly Nova Flared Zele. Well, not new anymore, it's been like 2 updates, and also main DPS Rin Tosaka. Both of them also would very much to like have Cerydra on their teams, as she does have a lot through her mechanic, her main function of being able to completely clone a skill. Her buffs itself have never really been that crazy. A bit of res pen from skill is nice. Skill damage when it is all upgraded to the paired state to get the clone has actually been pretty solid, but it is only for the clone instance and not really anything else. The main buff that was actually a common thing was the attack buff that she does give to the person that she has selected as military merit, but a big problem Cerydra always has was kind of the allocation of her kit. While she does have a really insane mechanic with the dupe of skill, one, the biggest buffs being only when it is upgraded to have that proc, which is more manageable and more understandable considering how insane it would be if it was for all of it. At least the attack buff is actually constantly active, but a lot of her kit has a bunch of stuff that really does not matter, such as her ultimate being an AoE hit to all enemies that does damage based off her attack, the additional win instance of damage she can do when the person that has the military merit is attacking, the fact she's able to increase her own crit damage based off her attack exceeding 2000, and also getting 100% crit rate regardless. She, at that lower investment that a lot of people have her at, E0, E1, maybe even E2, her damage is really not good and is not really something worth upgrading. You really just focus on just stacking speed and attack, and then her actual damage that she adds throughout the battle is very negligible. And if you run her with one of her best teammates, Phynon, you're departing him anyways. So, and not him, I mean, you're departing Cerydra. So Cerydra's not going to be able to attack once Phynon goes into ultimate, so all that is worthless. It's a bit different with Zele specifically, but also her 20 speed buff for both herself and the person with military merit. For herself is good because you are building her with speed, but it is 20 speed and not 20 base speed, so that's already useless for Phynon. Anaxa's best teams now make him be built with 0 speed as well. Some Zele instances you can actually have it be beneficial. You don't really build her with speed either, ideally if you have something like E2, and even at E0 you can opt to just go no speed. And since she's able to gain speed buffs throughout other means, you don't focus on it, but it's still somewhat useful there thanks to how just breakpoints work. And for Hyper Carry Rin, you also ignore speed entirely. So that speed buff is also just wasted buff, to be honest. It would have been better if it was something else. And that has kind of bit back a bit. Since a lot of our buffing potential itself is weak, it's mainly the skill duplication. But since there's so many interactions where it's super strong, such as Zele being able to get extra turns, and I mean extra turns, Phynon being able to do double meteor, which is one of the hardest hitting moves in the game, Anaxa being able to actually get quadruple skills, and Rin, as you know, you build her up, she is a tactical nuke, one-shot like everything. She can now do that twice. That's kind of how I thought about it, and that's why I do think that her allocation of what she does has been a bit wonky, but nonetheless her spot, as long as you use these kind of characters, is still what it is. She's not necessarily super replaceable yet. There are some instances saying Robin SP is going to be able to replace her in some teams like Phynon or even Anaxa, But considering the core role of what she does, it's still just super valuable. Even at E0, just the clone, but you really want to ideally nowadays get to that E1 since of how much defense ignore stacking you can do in this game. So E1 for her is also very nice. E2 is something you don't really have to look at too much. Her light cone is nice, but it was also released with the free-to-play light cone that you can get from the Herda shop, which is practically all you really need for her, or you run her on Dance 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 on other teams that are not really fine on it. Even on fine on teams for the early setup, you can't do it. So her vertical investment, E1 aside, doesn't really do much for her, but she still remained her wanting of being with these skill DPS characters for these characters specifically, and the list has slightly grown with Seele and also Rin. Then we get to Anaxa. So Anaxa is easier to talk about since he is a DPS. It's no longer the same case of when he did release, of course, where the biggest thing about Anaxa was he was able to be ran with really like everyone. The only thing that didn't really do much to him was like damage percent buffs, which is a good portion of the game, and it still does impact it, but he was attack deprived. You could give him a bunch of crit buffs. You could use him with so many characters thanks to just the amount of stats that he would get a benefit from, especially something like attack. Anaxa is super attack deprived, and instead he functions off a rare debuff or rare buff, being defense shred / defense ignore. He also had a release of it being, you know, the quote-unquote best in slot for the Herda, but I'm not really going to talk about the Herda just because she's not that good. Anaxa is still best in slot on the teams. However, Anaxa is just infinitely, and I mean infinitely better as just being ran as a hyper carry. It's been the same case since he did release. It was less so back then since the Herda was strong when he did release, but he was still better as a hyper carry. Once Cyrene came out, I mean, honestly, once Cerydra came out, it was not even close anymore. Cyrene came out, really nailed the coffin, and especially now, it's not even close. But for Anaxa himself, the situation has changed. He's not really a character where you can just run anyone anymore. His main best team is definitely something you want to do, which is both Cerydra and Cyrene. These are both characters you definitely want to do, as one, they pair so well to each other. They allow you to run the attack boots because Cyrene's action for her ult is going to be what gives Anaxa the turn, thanks to the fact it gives him the 100% action advance, gives him the extra skill instances and also some buffing, and also her general stuff like true damage and also damage percent, so on and so forth, which the damage percent is very small, so you don't focus on that, but the true damage and then the actual Chrysos Air buff. Also, her buff on Cerydra is going to further impact Anaxa's performance. Cerydra also giving Anaxa the quadruple skills we talked about in the Cerydra section. This team is something you definitely want to be having, and that's why you see like really every Anaxa clear in endgame mode for the lowest cost really just be like E0 Anaxa, E0 Cerydra, E2 Cyrene, and then RMC. This also might be able to change a decent amount because of the Robin SP, so potentially more team instances for Anaxa. But as a DPS in general nowadays, you really want to have Cerydra and also Cyrene, otherwise his performance is going to fall off a lot. As the game has naturally become a lot harder, not having the best team for him is going to do a lot worse. And then when you do take a look at his vertical investment, he actually does have one of the worst vertical investments we have gotten. He's kind of just like a E0 S1 unit and call it good. It gives him 10 energy at the start of the battle, or at the start of the turn for Anaxa, I mean. Can increase his damage to dealt to enemies where weakness is implanted, which he implants every weakness, which was another good point about him. And also is able to defense shred for 2 turns from any enemy that is attacked by the wearer. So it further helped his defense shred stacking. His E1 also did help it, but for another upwards of 80 pulls, you're getting a skill point back on the first time you use skill in the battle, and 16% defense shred for 2 turns when skill hits an enemy. That is horrible. It was really bad when he came out. Now you can imagine it's really, really bad now. His E2 is also pretty mid for an E2. Entering battle will let him trigger an instance of Talent's weakness implant effect and also reduce enemies all type res by 20%. If that was an E1, that would be completely different. That would be an insanely good E1. But for E2, and especially with the E2s we're getting nowadays, and even some E2s that we got back then, like we got Finon, we got Evernight, we had Cyrene, Castris, hell, even someone like Hyacine. There was a lot of E2s that were really good. This one is just not. So unfortunately, vertical investment has really, really scammed Anaxa. So a lot of his power has been being put into getting E2 Cyrene and like E1 Cerydra. So more of his strength comes from investing into other people. But as long as you do have the right team, so Cerydra and Cyrene, potentially even E2 Cyrene, which he can function off the E0 Cyrene setups, but you definitely need to play around it, which actually the new Robin SP makes it easier with how you can action advance starting with Cyrene and stuff. Same thing you can do with the mem setups with RMC. There are ways to do it with E0 Cyrene, but E2 Cyrene is like the first point. So as long as you have the team ready, he's going to be strong. If you don't have the team or you're missing some parts, the performance is going to drastically drop, as he is just not as good as he once used to be. While he's still very much usable with like just Cerydra or just Cyrene with some other setups you can do, it's overall just better maybe even investing the pulls into something else if you don't really have the full setup available. Finally, Aventurine. So this one is expected really about what I'm going to talk about. So from his time he released, he was quite literally the best sustain for the longest time. He was like the only real shielder in the game as well. But it's really hard to mention his standards now just because he was released on the 1st year anniversary and we're past the 3rd year anniversary. So his performance is more or less not going to be as good. Back then, his damage was actually very notable because you can imagine how low this kind of damage would be back when the game was newer. However, now his damage is completely negligible. But if you do just build him full shield with the shield set, support and stuff, the shield is still really strong, as you can probably imagine. The shield itself has really no issues in sustaining, but a big problem that Aventurine does have is the fact that he doesn't cleanse. He himself can resist ACC every one of his turns, but for other people, if they get CC'd, it's kind of bleak. But yeah, since a lot of his allocation is also in damage, which was really good back then, however, just no longer good, he doesn't have the power as modern sustains would. Another problem is that sustains aren't really released. That's why Aventurine can actually kind of stay afloat, which I don't know why I said a problem. That's honestly a good thing, but also not, because more sustains would make this easier. When you do compare him to the competition of sustains, the newer sustains just do way much more. Permanentary Donning would do everything Aventurine does, but better, has technically higher frequency, has better damage, has better shield, can cleanse. Only time would be where he doesn't have higher frequency is when the enemies attack a lot, so Aventurine can get a lot of follow-ups. That's about it. And then on the healer side, he can't heal, so Hyacine and also the newly buffed Fofo would have more priority there. He's also just not really on any teams either, because on the follow-up teams, you just run Permanentary Donning, or now Hyacine because of M-Blade, or even Fofo if you're running the Gilgamesh team. So Aventurine's value isn't really there. The only reason he stays afloat, as I mentioned, is there's not so many sustain options released, but there's enough to the point where you don't really have to consider him at all. If you already have like Permanentary Donning on your account, which was free, you're not going to have much value as Aventurine as a shielder. He's just kind of there as an option if you don't have any sustain available. Maybe you're just starting out and you really need one ASAP, which funny enough, Donning is rerunning right now. But if you just also happen to start after the banner leaves, that would be kind of like your only emergency case. But even then, it might be better off getting a new sustain, because it's rumored that we're about to get one soon, not next patch, but potentially 4.6 with Pearl. So that's also another thing. Vertical investment on him as well. The E1 is still okay. The crit damage buff is whatever. However, it at least allows him to give a shield that is equivalent of using skill. I don't know why I said using skill. So that allows the shield output to go up and also be able to be stacked. His E2 is pretty bad. It's really just the E1 for the quality of life of giving shield on his skill and ultimate now, thanks to what the E1 does. His light cone itself is also somewhat damage focused, but it does also provide an additional debuff, since it does increase his defense by a lot, so that is going to increase the sustaining potential and also his own crit damage, but also the 10% vulnerability it can give it, but that's not also that great. You really just give him the battle pass, light cone, and you would be good to go. And if you don't have that, you can just give him a co-op option. Pulling for his light cone is also not really that worth it. So yeah, Aventurine, his spot isn't super valuable right now. It's just the fact that he's a shielder and just a sustain in general that's able to at least sustain in a time period where we're not really getting many sustains. Now finally, reasons why you should or should not summon, starting with Cerydra. So if you play fine on Anaxa, main DPS Rin or Zele, I highly recommend Cerydra. Her clone of skill is very powerful, even though I talked about all the weird allocation of her kit. They're all attack scalers that get a benefit from that, especially someone like Anaxa. Once it's upgraded, they can get extra 72% skill damage and also 10% res pen. That's going to be beneficial across all of them. And then the clone skill, that's going to be super valuable, as you're getting 2 meteors, 4 Anaxa skills, 2 Biden blasts from Rin, and Zele potentially proccing more and more extra turns to have an absolute snowball effect. So that, for those characters, is super valuable. So if you play them, or you want to play them, Cerydra is very much a recommended character. And that's kind of it. That's like the only way you want to look out for it. If you don't use any of them, then I would not recommend Cerydra really at all. She's not going to do much. The only setup she really has outside of that is like E1 Maide, where you're supposed to time it, so you do get God Sir Be God cloned. That's also possible, but that has way more replaceable options as opposed to these other 4 that get much more of a benefit. So those are the main cases. If you don't have any of them and you don't want to use any of them or you don't plan on it, then I don't recommend Cerydra. When it comes to investing in Cerydra, honestly, I just recommend going for E1. That defense ignore and shred stuff is really good. For Finon specifically, there's an extra 2 energy to generate a core flame there. So if you're using her with Finon, then that's more value to you. But since how defense ignore / shred is working in this game, the more you get, the better. So that's why Cerydra's E1 does help a ton with that across all these teams. So for investment in her, I highly would recommend E1. Then when it comes to Anaxa, I recommend Anaxa if you do at least have the team ready for him, and you also do have the need for a DPS, because if you're summoning for DPS and you don't have a need for DPS, there's no point. So if you have Cerydra on your account already, then Anaxa can actually be made pretty powerful, especially if you have E2 Cerydra already, since his performance with that team is actually still very good. But that's kind of where the extent would go, because even in a sense with Anaxa, there are, of course, nowadays better options. You can invest pulls into his teams instead in something like Bladeville. So that still does exist as an option. So that's why I only really recommend if you are in need of a DPS, if you do have the team already ready, or you do plan on pulling them. Like, let's say maybe you don't have Cerydra and you plan on getting her now, you plan on getting Cyrene on the rerun, then in that case, you can pick up Anaxa for that plan. If you're missing them, I don't recommend it. As I did mention, he can work without it, but the performance is going to drop off so much to the point it just does not matter. So I only really recommend him if you do have his team or you plan on fully getting the Cerydra Cyrene thing. Since the last slot is a bit more flexible, you can use RMC, you can use Robin SP if you pull for her. If you have E2 Cyrene, you can even use someone like Sparkle in that slot, so on and so forth. And then for investment into him, I really just recommend stopping at his Lycone. E0, S1 is fine. His E1's really bad. His E2's okay, but for an E2 standpoint, it's not great. And I would rather say use those pulls into investing into his supports instead. Get Cerydra E1, get Cyrene E2, and then your last slot could also even have more valuable stuff, such as Summer Robin E2, Sparkle E2, so on and so forth. So you could save those pulls for that instead of investing into Anaxa, where his dupes are just not that good. Finally, for Aventurine, I honestly just don't really recommend pulling for him at all. While he is still very much usable, it's generally just not worth it. What he brings to the table as a sustain, besides sustaining, which is not enough for a sustain role nowadays considering what they can do, it's just not worth it. So he can still sustain, but he's not able to cleanse. He doesn't do good damage anymore. His debuffs of like the unnerve debuff of making enemies take 15% more crit damage, and then his vertical investment not being that great on top of it, it's just not enough. At this point, you'd be better off just using Donning, or if you already pulled for Donning, that's going to be a significant upgrade to Aventurine at really any investment. And then a lot of teams also potentially just using healers instead, where Aventurine wouldn't be able to do anything there either. Unfortunately, Aventurine has lived out his time. He was great for a really long time, so he has done his role. It's time for him to rest. So the real case of pulling him would only be for someone that's brand new, that you literally just started and you missed Donning, or you couldn't pull Donning because you just couldn't grind enough and you just really need to sustain for whatever reason. That's really the only case. For a more established account, there's just better options. It's just not worth it. Those pulls are better allocated elsewhere. So for Aventurine, I don't really recommend pulling him in any case except that one very specific beginner niche case. And of course, at the same time would mean I don't recommend investing into him, as his E1, it's quality of life that's good if you do actively use them. So if you have them and you really want to pull them and you want to waste the pulls on, then you can go for the E1 instead. For the light cone, just stick with the battle pass one if you can get that. The light cone for his signature is fine for what he does, but the battle pass will just do the job better. So investment wise into him would mainly just be E1, and that's kind of it. If you're really pushing it, then you can get the light cone, but that would be the extent of it. And that is, should you or should you not summon for the reruns, going over practically everything you do need to know from their spot of release and how they're holding up now. I do hope you found this video helpful. If you did, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell for future videos like this, along with all the types of style content. And I'll see you later. Peace out.